The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 19, Cathedral of Invalids. At one end of the crowded room, Katie stood with an egg timer. "Everybody ready now?" she called out. "Count." 80 women lay on the narrow hospital cots, finger on pulse, a look of agonized concentration on their faces. 27, 28, 29 came from one bed. 31, 32, 33 came in a rising crescendo from the one next to it. "Not so loud," from another bed. "I've lost track," came a wail from another. "You must concentrate harder, ladies," Katie pleaded. "Now we'll have to start all over." She waited a moment, then turned the egg timer. "Count." This time there were no interruptions, and each patient monitored her own pulse, beginning in a whisper and rising at the end of 3 minutes to a full-voiced recital of varying astronomical figures. Of course, the number had to be divided by 3, which precipitated another crisis for poor Katie. Those who had too high a pulse rate got a thermometer thrust under the armpit as the next step in our nursing procedure. It was also the last step, as we had no other means of diagnosis or treatment. These 2 small ceremonies were inviolable and conformed to the principles of good nursing insisted upon by the one nurse added to our number at Waldeheim. I was assigned here for a time also, along with Katie, this motherly woman who still showed some traces of having once been very attractive. She had a husband and 2 teenage children waiting for her in Hamburg, and she longed for them desperately. All the care and affection she couldn't give her own family, she lavished on her patients here, so that even though she couldn't do much to relieve the physical distress, she was always ready with a reassuring and comforting word, a cheery smile, a cool hand on a fevered forehead. We like to think that some of our patients got well because of our loving attention, and perhaps that really was the case. At any rate, our work in the hospital became a kind of religious vocation, and the room itself a place hallowed by suffering. It seemed appropriate to call that building through which so many of us passed, either as patients or as nurses, the Cathedral of Invalids. Rarely was one of the beds empty. After 6 or 7 years in camp and prison, none of us were really well. Eventually, another building had to be prepared for the same use, and here I was assigned to the tuberculosis cases. It was a depressing task. We knew our patients wouldn't get well. They knew it too. The worst cases were isolated in separate cells that practiced medically sound, certainly, but wretchedly dismal for those who were dying far from loved ones. Liesel was only 20. In normal life, she would no doubt have been a vivacious and energetic young woman, and would perhaps never have succumbed to a latent tendency toward this terrible disease. Somewhere in a cold, damp prison, however, she contracted TB and was dying. The cell where Liesel lay had no view to the outside, and when I was called to this ward, she was no longer able to walk to the hallway where the windows were. "Carry me out, Maria," she'd ask. "I want to see the sun." She felt like a child in my arms, and gladly I did it. Since our guards were always deathly afraid of tuberculosis, we had considerable freedom here. Especially agreeable was the elderly man who was usually stationed as guard in our TB ward. He himself was ill, and my hot compresses for the liver pains he suffered bought me more than a few concessions for my poor patients. On a sunny spring day, I carried Liesel like a baby down the winding staircase, feeling her hot breath on my face, her thin arms around my neck. As we reached the ground floor, she began to cough convulsively. When she'd recovered a bit, I eased her gently down onto the steps in the bright sunshine. "I won't get better, will I, Maria?" she said. It seemed more a statement than a question, and I left it unanswered. "Maria," she went on, looking at me with a gentle smile, "God has answered my prayers as he thinks best. I'll go to my heavenly home and wait for my parents there." She tried to squeeze my hand, but was too weak. With the sun shining on her face and the light of heaven in her eyes, she passed into the presence of her Savior. Though I wept for Liesel, I couldn't wish her back. To say that there was no real nursing in the ward was quite true, but it was a different matter in the operating room. Here there were instruments, medications, anesthetic, everything that a small surgery needed. Our Professor von Wolf, who had been transferred to Waldeheim with me, no doubt saved countless emergency cases here, while in the hospital countless others, whose ailments were far less complicated, died for lack of the simplest medicines. The official staff doctor, a man with the military rank of major, was extraordinarily kind. Daily he made his rounds, a white jacket over his uniform, in company with Professor von Wolf. The first time I addressed him as an officer with his proper title, he told me, "Frau Linke, I want you to remember that I am first of all a doctor, then an officer. Saving lives is my main concern." His behavior more than bore out his claim. That he couldn't do a better job of it wasn't his fault, I was convinced. That 1 year after I met him, he too became a prisoner, likely had something to do with his humanitarian views, even as Nicotine's had led to his downfall. After Liesel's death, Professor von Wolf had a new assignment for me, which moved me to the surgical ward. A prisoner had had a serious operation, needing heat on her abdomen, and having nothing but an old-fashioned metal-type hot water bottle. The patient had been badly burned by a careless nurse, and in this seared flesh 2 abscesses had festered. When she also developed pneumonia, I was called to nurse her. "Here's a real case for you, Maria. Don't expect too much, though I doubt she'll live." That's the way it was. Neither Professor von Wolf's good intentions and devotion nor mine could always spell success for our patients. Nevertheless, I spent every moment I could with the woman, helping her to breathe deeply and encouraging her. I wanted so much to prove the doctor's prognosis wrong for the patient's sake. "Do you think, Maria, that you should be spending so much time with a murderess?" The words spoken in such a disapproving voice by the nurse at my side shocked me. I was struggling to save the life of a murderess, was I? Stunned, I looked down at the scared eyes looking up at me from the bed. How ordinary and defenseless the woman looked. But she had murdered someone, perhaps someone just as helpless as she was now. That night I couldn't sleep. If this woman had killed once, she might do it again. Perhaps she'd be out of prison long before I. Was I saving her life so that she could commit more crimes? Around and around my thoughts went. After all, there were other patients to care for, more worthy ones. And how about "thou shalt not kill"? The Bible was plain as to the consequences. The thing at the root of it all, however, the ugly thing that really had to surface, was my feeling that I didn't belong here and she did. God really had to deal with me that night. Not so much about her as about myself. It was true, I hadn't murdered, but during those hours such a vivid recital of my own failures was dramatized before my humbled imagination that I could hardly wait until morning to run to the surgical ward and join my patient again. No matter that I wasn't guilty of what they'd accused me, there were so many other things that only I knew about. "Judge not, lest you be judged." Jesus had said. My feet flew. Suddenly it had become terribly important to me that this woman should recover. To care for her was no longer burdensome, and as I hovered by her side, I prayed, "Lord, bless my work and make her well. She hasn't any chance. The doctor said so. You made this body. You'll have to repair it." Even as God answered this prayer, he did a wholesome work in my own spirit, so that 3 months later, when my patient joined us on our daily walk outside, I had a double prayer of thanksgiving in my heart. I had an opportunity to become much more intimately acquainted with the surgical ward when I became a patient there myself. For days I'd had a pain in my side. When it finally became so severe that I couldn't go to work, I reported to the medical officer. He ordered an exploratory operation. I was frightened. I remembered the post-operative pain at Buchenwald, but the doctor was kindly concerned as usual, and I soon found myself staring about the white tile and chrome-fitted room from the operating table, noting with satisfaction the cabinet full of instruments and the presence of my beloved Professor von Wolf. The anesthetic put me to sleep quickly, and when I woke up, my appendix was gone. I was grateful that I had had only an inflamed appendix, and I looked forward to a luxurious time during my recovery. There were 5 of us in one room, locked in, but who cared? At least no guard was watching every move we made. We talked and slept and grumbled a bit, who doesn't after an operation, and reveled in the novelty of being waited on. Margaret fed me, Annalisa gave me a bath, and Cornelia rubbed my back. The doctors visited me faithfully and congratulated me on my good recovery. Then suddenly the visits ceased. When neither von Wolf nor the medical officer had showed up for several days, I got worried. My stitches were to have been removed, and the incision was getting infected. I called a guard and asked when either of them would come. Never, was the abrupt answer. I was desperate. My temperature went up. The stitches hurt. Back at the dorm, Mutti was on duty, and when Margaret asked her about it, the news was bad. Both doctors had been put in solitary, reason unknown. Well, if that was the case, I'd have to do the job myself, I decided. Requesting scissors to cut my fingernails, I probed about for a likely place to begin in my swollen scar. A careful insertion of the blade, a very tiny snip, and one stitch was out. I became more courageous. There went another, and another. One more to go when the guard sailed in to demand the scissors. The remaining thread took a bit of maneuvering to get out, but at last it also yielded to my careful tugs, and the job was finished. When Professor von Wolf returned in a few days, he was astonished at what I had done. Later, I had to tease him that my upside-down operation at Buchenwald, where I'd been sewn up with nylon parachute thread, had left me with a far more beautiful scar than my operation here in our modern Waldeheim surgery. The Lord helped in both places in time of need, however, and soon I was up and nursing my fellow prisoners again. While we in the hospital tried desperately to save lives, some of our inmates never ceased looking for ways to take their lives. The means were few, and hanging remained the most common. But if the means were few, the moments of privacy to accomplish it were even fewer. Besides, all of us had gotten extremely sensitive to the mood and circumstances most likely to lead to self-destruction. It seems almost irreverent to speak of innovations in suicide, but there was one attempt which must surely have been unique. Anna was a large, plodding sort of woman, unimaginative, and not too communicative. No doubt she'd once been quite stout. Now her skin hung in great sagging folds from chest and belly. How Anna managed to sew 2 folds of this bulging flesh together in the sewing room without anyone knowing it, I can't imagine, but the result from the dirty needle was as expected, and Anna got a severe infection. It wasn't bad enough to do any more than land her in the hospital and earn a severe reprimand. Poor Anna, she'd wanted so much to die. Others tried less bizarre methods, often equally unsuccessful. Marta got a few long strands of hair from the unshorn head of one of the later arrivals and wrapped them tightly around the end of her finger one night. In the morning she removed the hair from the terribly painful joint, hoping that the unpurified blood, which was then released, would flow into the rest of her body and spread its poison. Some prisoners were successful in taking their lives, but never Marta. Our Cathedral of Invalids even saw the denouement of a crime under the strangest of circumstances. I was on night duty in the medical ward. As usual, it was filled with the gravely ill or those whose life processes were just too feeble to respond when simpler ailments struck. The guard had left for the night, leaving me and 2 others alone with our roomful of sick women. There were the restless ones to soothe and those whose pains were always worse when the daytime distractions had ceased. Even here the lights were left on all night and made sleep difficult for those who might have slept otherwise. Night duty seemed very, very long, always. I was concerned about Grandma Lena. She'd hung on for so long now, but there just didn't seem any reserves left, and though she had no particular ailment or complaint, everything seemed simply to have run down for her. That night she asked in her feeble voice if we might sing to her. "What would you like, Grandma Lena?" I asked in a whisper. "Nearer, my God, to thee," came the quiet request. All around me I could feel the reaction of patients still awake. There was a sense of a presence in the room, the presence of one who had been there before and had removed one here and one there. The choice of him itself seemed to confirm the strange feeling. Quietly we nurses gathered by the bed and began to sing softly. When we had sung the first line, a voice from one of the other beds called out querulously, "Stop, stop, I can't stand that song. Anyway, it's late." It was late, that was true, but we couldn't ignore what might be Grandma's last request, so we quietly continued. A few other weak voices joined in the melody. This time the cry was agonized. "Stop, I tell you, that was my mother's favorite song, and I killed her." The voice was almost to a shriek. Every patient in the room, now fully awake, stared in horror as Barbara, sobbing convulsively, buried her face in her blanket. We tried to calm her, but again and again she demanded that the guard be called. "I must confess, I have to. I can't stand it any longer." "Wait until morning, Barbara. The other patients. You must calm yourself." My persuasions were useless. Whatever it was that Barbara had kept hidden had to be revealed tonight, now. We called until the guard who had locked us in returned, angry at the commotion. As Barbara sobbed out the wretched story, he wrote it all down. She'd had a happy home until her father had gone off to war, and her mother had had to go to work. For diversion, she'd started shoplifting with a group of friends. Sensing that something was wrong, her mother had pleaded with her not to be away from home so much. Barbara had defended her right to live her own life, and the arguments had grown more frequent and bitter. By the time the shoplifting had turned into organized stealing, there was no longer any possibility of meaningful communication between mother and daughter. Then came the news that her father had been killed. It seemed to lift all the restraints, and Barbara looked only to her wild crowd of friends for approval and recognition. There came a day when the gang converged on the house after a robbery, looking for a hiding place. Unexpectedly, Barbara's mother had been at home. Horrible as it had been, she'd agreed that she had to be killed, and even worse, had committed the murder herself. They'd gotten away and managed to cover their tracks, but Barbara was haunted by the fear that the crime would eventually be discovered, so she'd had one of her friends report her to the police on the more minor charge of possession and reading of West German political magazines. She'd thought that somehow the police would be sidetracked. Barbara had been sentenced to 2 years and might never have come to justice on the murder and robbery charges if Grandma Lena, as she lay dying, hadn't requested the mother's favorite song. Before Barbara was taken away, I spoke to her of Christ's forgiveness for a repentant heart, but it didn't seem to penetrate. I had to hope that if her conscience had carried her this far, it might even bring her to real brokenness at the foot of the cross. Though some circumstances were more unusual than others, each death was terribly real and poignant for me. Saddest of all seemed the impossibility of letting loved ones know. Each time we lost one of our women, I thought about my own family and the long years they'd waited for news of my brother. Whether they themselves lived or not, I couldn't be sure, but if they did, I knew that my disappearance added to whatever burden of suffering they were bearing. In order to do what I could to ease this burden for others, if I ever got out, I memorized the names and addresses of over 80 relatives of prisoners I'd known in the camps. Whether the news I'd someday carry, God willing, was good or bad, I knew it would be better than the uncertainty that must have tortured these loved ones. Throughout my years at Buchenwald and Waldeheim, I carried those names and addresses in my memory as a sacred trust until the day when I could fulfill each promise.